Okay. So yeah, we're going to talk about generating patterns. We're going to kind of start where we left off on Monday with our nested for loop to create our grid-based pattern. And we're going to add a little bit of randomness to it to make it a little bit more interesting. So as usual, if you guys have questions at all while I'm going through these slides, just let me know. We can go over them. So I'm gonna open up the project that I started on Monday and make a new copy of it. Um, so I'm just gonna go over to P5 and here's my nested loop. And so we use a nested loop on Monday to create a pattern that's already, kind of interesting. We've got these like different cells that are repeating, and so we can create kind of an interesting pattern just with a few shapes. So we're gonna keep working with this, but we're gonna make it a little bit more interesting by adding some randomness in there so we can actually create some variation within the pattern. So I'm gonna make a copy of this. I'm gonna duplicate this and call this generated patterns. And let me just update this comment a little bit. Okay. And so in some ways, we're actually going to like simplify the way that this works compared to like the patterns that we were doing before. I'm just going to make some like simple choices between different lines. But I might do a few different examples of things that we can make choices or change based on our patterns. Okay, so let's look at the slides, but I'm going to come back here to make changes to the setup that we've got here. Okay, so generating patterns. So this is another thing. We talked about using interaction and how that's something we can really only do with code, as opposed to designing. As a designer, if we want to work on just a flat design in Illustrator or Photoshop or something like that, there's a lot of tools there that make it easier to do some of the things that we can do with code as well. Like, just drawing basic graphics is a lot easier to do with a program like Illustrator. But what we can't do in those programs and why we need to use code in certain contexts as designers or artists is that we can't do interaction. And we also can't do what we're going to do today, which is this kind of like infinite variation. So using code, we can use randomness and other things to create variations that we would be difficult to create just through a sort of like GUI interface like Photoshop or Illustrator. So we're going to start from this like grid pattern that we created the other day and then add some randomness, use some environment variables and things like that to make our composition a little bit more interesting. So this is what we've already got set up. I'm going to kind of go back to what this looks like. So I'm going to take out some of this stuff that we did the other day, and I'm just going to draw our rectangles again. So I'm going to draw, oh wait, let's get rid of that. So using my for loop, and I'm going to increase the number of columns and rows here for a second. And let's actually I'm going to make my grid a little bit smaller so we can see the whole thing. So I'm going to make a 400 by 400 canvas. And so I have 12 rows and 12 columns. And so using code, I can kind of decide the size of my grid and then use some basic math to divide up the grid into the right uh, number of columns and rows. And then I'm just using a little for loop where I'm looping across the columns using the X value, starting at 0 and just moving across the canvas until I get to the other side, which is width. And then every time I go to a new column, I'm going through all of the rows. So I'm starting with y equals 0 at the top, and I keep going until we get to the bottom of the canvas, which is height, and I'm increasing by the height of each one of my rows. And so to illustrate this, I'm just drawing a rectangle here where we have x, y, width, and height, and that's how we get these basic grid that we see on the canvas now.
I'm so sorry. I have a question.
Go for it.
So if you just draw 12 rows and columns, why do you need line 16 and 17? Aren't they doing the same? Am I like confusing between them?
Um, yes. So, so 16 is our columns. Um, and so if we didn't have line 17, if I take line 17 out for a second, uh, oh, I don't have y here. So,
But
uh,
didn't you write earlier, um, uh, if you scroll up a little bit, didn't you write rows and columns above it?
yeah.
Yeah,
So
let's call it rows.
right. So I'm starting here. I'm setting what the number I want is, but then with the rest of the code is it's taking that number and it's implementing the design. So I'm setting the number of columns here. I'm saying let columns equals 12, but that doesn't actually draw columns. It's just like
Oh,
it's just saying what the
okay.
number is. So I say that I want 12 columns, and the rest of the code is actually doing the work. So first I'm figuring out how wide each column should be. So I'm taking the whole width of the canvas and I'm dividing the number by the number of columns. So what that
So it's
does,
just instead of writing 12, because you can change it later, like the number of
yeah,
how many.
exactly.
I see. Okay, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is the width of one column, this W here. So, one of these boxes. And then this for loop is basically saying, for let x equals 0, x is less than or equal to width, x plus equals w. So that is starting at 0 here, this first box, and then each box is x plus equals w. So it goes from the first box to the next box to the next box to the next box, and it keeps going. And I'm using this to count because I want to basically count across the whole canvas. And then this middle condition says, once I've drawn this last box, I don't need to draw a box over here on the other, at the end of the canvas because we're not going to see that. So we just need to draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 boxes, and then we're done. So that's the columns. And if I change this to like 8, as you mentioned, now I have 8 boxes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's a good thing to point out is that this columns, I'm just saying how many columns I want, but it doesn't actually draw any columns. What draws the columns is my for loop, which just draws one rectangle for each column. And then same thing with the y. So if I take out my x for loop and I bring back my y for loop, and I'm going to have to put y back in here, and we'll change x to 0. Now we just get one column with 12 rows. And so that's what the Y does. So 16 draws all of the columns, but inside of 16, inside of my first for loop, that's what my second for loop does. The Y for loop draws each box in each row. And that's how I end up with a whole grid based on just saying rectangle once. See how this only draws one rectangle? I only have one rectangle that I'm even drawing at all so far in the code. I can actually just delete this. But what my loop does is it repeats that rectangle based on these conditions. So for the Y loop, I draw a rectangle for each row going down the page. And then if I bring back in my X loop and I put an X here, that draws all of my rectangles. So this one rectangle is always the same, but the for loops are what's making me go across and down the page and draw in different places. Um, so hopefully that clarifies that a bit.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
hmm Um, So drawing a grid is cool, but it's not super exciting. So what can we do um, to kind of vary the grid? So we already actually did this. We covered this on Monday. Um, so we can just put in some random colors. Let's see what that'll look like if we just put in some random colors. So this is kind of like what we did with our patterns. But for now, let's do this um, with our rectangles. And what I want to do actually is do what I did before. So I'm going to push and translate to XY and then pop. So instead of drawing a rectangle at XY, now I can just draw a rectangle at 0, 0, because I'm moving the whole canvas. I'm translating the entire canvas to each XY position across my grid, and then I'm drawing a rectangle there. So this will set up our translation, and then we'll draw a rectangle. And now let's just change the color. So I'm just going to do a random color. I'm going to say red is a random color, 0 to 255. And green is a random value, 0 to 255. And B, blue, is a random value. And so now I'll just do a fill RGB. And so now I just have a bunch of random colors. Let's turn off the stroke so we can see the colors a little better. So now I have just complete randomness. So there's not, much of a pattern. There's not a lot of stuff that makes sense here because everything is just random. I'm just, adding random colors, and that could be cool. You might want something that is just completely random colors. But if we want to change this a little bit, I can, randomize some colors and not others. So for example, let's say I wanted more green. I could say, green starts at 100 and goes to 255. So things will be a little bit more green overall because the minimum amount of green is higher. If I want a little less red, I could cap red at like 150. And so now I'll have more green and blue. And then I can also change values based on where they are. So I can use what I know about my composition to change the values a little bit. So for example, with green, I could map it. I could map it just like we map our mouse. So I could say map the y value. So the y value goes from 0 to height, and so I could map my green value from 0 to 255. And so now it'll get greener as it goes down the page. So now I can actually get some cool effects using some of the stuff that we've already learned in previous examples. And if I make this like a lot bigger, like let's say I had 120 columns and 120 rows, now it's starting to look like this interesting kind of gradient. So depending on how we set up our canvas and how we set up our design, we can get a lot of different interesting effects. So we're using some randomness and some, uh, choices about what we want in terms of the size and the position and things like that. And that's going to allow us to create a lot more interesting patterns than we could necessarily just using just our basic shapes. So this is kind of cool. I'm going to keep working with this. So I can vary my colors, and I can change the range of colors like we did just now, um, and map my colors. We can change the size. So this is an easy one. We can randomize our size a little bit. So right now I'm using width and height, but I could add to or modify width and height. One thing I want to be careful about here is I don't actually want to change the width and height variables because that will change the way my loop works. So if I change width, let's see if I take width and I like add 5 to it every time. Now we're going to see, you know, this is going to change the width of the actual loop. Or if I randomize this, if I say, 5 to 10, since it's changing the actual conditions of the loop, it's breaking the pattern a little bit. So these values that I created up here, I don't really want to change these. I might even want to make these a constant, or actually, no, we haven't talked about that. So let's ignore that for now. Anyway, so I don't want to change width, but I can make other values in here. So I could say like variable, let's call it RW for rectangle width. And I could take width as my basis, but then I could add a random number to it. Maybe it's like -5 to 5. And so now I can use RW instead of W in my rectangle. And that's going to change my pattern a little bit more. So we get a different effect with that. Let's do 80 columns and 80 rows so we can see the effect of that a little bit better. And so now we're actually seeing a little bit into the background because we're not fully, covering each part of our grid. We could make this even bigger so we get a much wider variety of shapes. And so now we get a different style. So we can get a lot of really interesting different types of patterns just by adding simple variations to the size or to the color. So let's do something for the height. So let's do RH for rectangle height. And I'll say H plus random. I'll do even wider range for this, and so that'll kind of change even more what happens here. So that's kind of interesting. We're getting some different effects that way. So it's kind of cool. It's mostly kind of abstract, but you could start to impose some different concepts on this. Like if you wanted to, make something that looks like a particular type of scene. Maybe this is like a green field with like a sunset behind it or something like that. I could start to add some variations and try to control the variations to get some different things here. I'm just going to put a note here for rect width, rect height can't change W and H. Okay, so that's another type of variation that we can add is the size. So then another thing that we can do is we can actually randomize what shape we're drawing. And this was actually a question I think Ben was asking on Monday, but Ben's not here now, but I'm sure he'll take a look at this when he gets a chance. So right now we're just taking numbers that we know we need to use, like the red value, the green value, the blue value. I'm just put a note here that says randomize color and randomize size. But we can also randomize this function right here, the rectangle that we're actually drawing. So I could say something like if, and I could make a choice. So let's actually do a random choice. So I'll say let shape is probably, I bet shape is a function in P5. So let's just use sh for shape. So let's say let shape equals random. Oh, actually we haven't covered this yet. So let's just say random uh, let's do three potential shapes. So I'll do random 0 to 3. And I'm going to round this so that I have a whole number, not like a big long float number. So this is going to be, I guess we only need, let's do 1 to 3. So then I can use this, whatever this turns out to be, I can test that. So here's where I can use an if statement to decide which shape to use. So I'll say if sh for shape equals 1, then I'll draw a rectangle. So now, before I add my other shapes, it's only going to draw rectangles sometimes. So we have a lot fewer rectangles in here. Since we're making them so much bigger, it's kind of hard to tell. Um, but we're not drawing as many rectangles as we were before. So then I can say else here, and I can draw something else. So if we're not going to draw a rectangle, let's bring back our lines. So let's draw a line. This time I'll draw a line or actually, if we draw a line, then we'll have to turn stroke back on. So I'll put my no stroke into here, and I'll do stroke RGB here as well. Okay, so if I want to draw a line, I can do what I did before. I'll draw a line 0, 0, and then width and height on the other side. And so now it's kind of hard to see them, but there's a lot of little lines on there now. Let's turn the stroke weight up. So I'll turn the stroke weight up to, let's do like 5. It's still kind of hard to see them. My rectangles are too big. So let's turn the width of our rectangles down a bit. Let's do 10 to 10 and 20 to 20 for the height. Okay, so now we can see some of the lines. It's kind of hard to see given how small they are, but you can see it has a different quality, right? So let's go back to like 10 columns and 10 rows. We'll be able to see this a little better. Okay, so this is a little bit easier to see what's happening here. Now we have these like different lines with different colors. And we can even cross our lines. So I'll copy this and move this guy over just like we did on Monday. So now we'll have some crosses. So that's kind of cool. So if we zoom back in a little bit, now we can see this a little bit better. We can see some different variations here. And now let's restrict this. So instead of else, I'm going to say else if sh equals 2. So now we only have some crosses and some rectangles. So then let's add our last condition. So else if sh equals 3. And let's do an arc here. So I'll do an arc. And for this one, let's actually just draw the outline of the arc. So I'll say no fill here. So let's do an arc again. We'll do 0, 0 with height, and I'll do 0 to pi again here. Okay, so we've got some arcs. I kind of want to go the other way. Let's go pi to 2 pi. And let's increase the stroke weight as well. Say stroke weight is 5. I'm getting an error. Oh, I left out a parentheses back here. Okay, so I've got more arcs. My arcs don't really connect with my lines, my crosses, so let's move it over. Let's go to width over 2, so we're halfway through the cell. So that's kind of cool. That's kind of interesting. So again, my pattern's going to look really different if I'm like zoomed in or zoomed out. Let's actually just randomize the number of columns and rows I have. So let's say random, or actually let's give the user control over this. So that's the last little bit I'll do, and then I'll be done. So I'm kind of wrapping everything together. So let's give the user the ability to control the columns and rows. And so remember, to do that, I'm going to have to move all of this stuff into a different function. Right now, I'm still inside of my setup function. So let's close my setup function and add in a pattern function. And then I'm going to call the pattern function over here. Okay, so now I'm going to give the user the ability to change the number of rows and columns. So I'm going to use a slider for this. So I'll have a couple sliders. These need to be global, so I can set them up in setup and then reference them in pattern. So I'll say my column slider and my row slider. And I need to set these up before I call pattern so that the values work. So I'll say column slider. And so for this one, remember I just say create slider, and then I give it the current value that I want to start at. So I'll start with 12, and then I want to give it the minimum value. So let's say the minimum value is 1, and a maximum value. Let's say 100 for now. And that's pretty much it for that one. So then row slider is the same thing. We're going to create a slider, and we'll do the same thing. We'll start at 12. Minimum value is 1. Maximum value is 100. I think I have that right. Let's go to the reference and double check. Um, yeah.
When you write 12, what do you mean? Start from 12, what?
So that's what it'll be when we start. And actually, I want to double check to make sure that's right. So I'm going to go to the create slider documentation. So the slider, oh, actually, no, I got it backwards. So I have to start with minimum value, maximum value, and then the third argument should be the starting value. So I'm going to switch this. I'm going to go 1 to 100 and then 12. So when I create a slider, there's a minimum and a maximum value. So when you see these two sliders down here, uh, there's a minimum value, so what it is all the way on the left, and then there's a maximum value is what it is all the way on the right. So on the left it'll be 1, on the right it'll be 100, and then the third number is optional, but it tells it where to start. So I'm going to make these sliders a little bit bigger. So I'm going to go to style.css and say input, say zoom is 2. I think that'll do it. There we go. So you can see 12 is like pretty close to the left side. If I made this 50, it's going to be exactly in the middle. So notice my first slider is exactly in the middle. My second slider is not. So yeah, that's what that number is where we want to start. And then eventually I'm going to use this number to set the columns. So when I go into my pattern, instead of columns equals 10, I'm going to say columns equals column slider dot value. I think is it dot value or dot, yeah, dot value. And then for my rows, I'll say row slider dot value. Okay, so now it's going to be whatever this slider is at. Although the one issue here is that I need to tell it to update. So I need to connect these to the function. So I can say column slider dot, I think it's input, and then we want to call pattern. So basically, this is just an event. So anytime we change the column slider, I want to redraw my pattern. So I just take this pattern function and put it into this argument for the input. So now anytime I move a slider, it should change my design. And you can actually start to see P5 slowing down a little bit. Um, so I think I'm actually kind of pushing the limits of what it wants to do graphics wise. But you can see I can get some different kind of like cool effects by changing these values. So I could do something with just 2 columns and lots of rows, and I can get some different patterns that way. Or I can mix and match different amounts. So these are just kind of examples. Any number that you use in here, like the red value, the green value, blue value, these width and height, these values, uh, any of these numbers, you can attach these to a slider or attach them to a button and give your user the ability to, change what the pattern looks like. And since we're using randomness, it's always a little bit different. So there is some parts of it are choices, like the bottom of my pattern is always a little bit more green than the top of the pattern. And so that's a choice that I made. But having this user interface also lets my user kind of make choices about what they want to see from the pattern. So I'm kind of combining some generative stuff with some interactive stuff in this example. So I think that's everything I want to cover. Let's take a look. So yeah, this is kind of like throwing a lot of stuff together. So over the past few weeks, we learned about these DOM elements. So we're using these sliders again, but you could use buttons or other things. We learned about functions. So we created a custom function to draw the pattern. And then the pattern in this case is kind of taking place of our normal draw function, so that instead of constantly redrawing, we're only drawing when the user makes changes by using the interface. And then, we're doing some other stuff here with our for loops that we learned a couple weeks ago. And then we're using our transformation. We're using our map function to set the green color. And we're also using our conditional statements to choose different shapes to draw in each part of our design. So this example is really combining like tons of stuff that we've learned throughout the semester. We are getting close to the end of the semester, so we want to kind of see all these things working together. But your assignment doesn't have to have all of this stuff in it. It just has to have, some of the basic components. So you can pick and choose what things you think are interesting and try to make some choices about what you think would be cool as a, little pattern generator exercise. Um, so I'm gonna save this and I'll put this in the voice chat.
Professor,
Yeah,
if if the demonstration is over, uh, I would like to ask if you could go over the push and the pull and push again. Like I
sure.
didn't really get that concept. Um,
Yeah, no
yeah, if
problem.
you can explain it again, thanks.
Yeah. Let me stop this recording